Hey everyone, hope you're having a good day today. What we're going to be doing in this video is covering what is Axios and what are interceptors inside of Axios that enable us to react to events before and after HTTP requests. If you don't know what Axios is, it's just an HTTP client that sits on top of basically your fetch or XML HTTP requests you would regularly do in vanilla JavaScript, but abstracts that to make your code much more clean and more usable in a way where you set defaults inside your Axios client so that you don't have to hard code those things every request you make inside of your JavaScript application. That being said, let's hop right into coding this up and see how we can use Axios to react to events before and after. All right, now that we're in our editor here, we're going to init basically our npm package.json file, which we're going to use to install basically Axios. So npm init in your terminal. We're just going to go through all these options, just say defaults. Yep. They're clear. And we're going to type npm install Axios. All right, here let's install our package.json file as a dependency. And now we're just going to import our Axios instance here. So equals require Axios. So we have that imported. Now what we're going to do is say we're going to make a GET request for some content. So we're going to do axios.get slash, well, we need a URL. So I'm going to be using basically a placeholder I'm going to be using a placeholder REST service. So I'm going to use JSON's placeholders / post service here to just get some fake data for our API to make requests to. And then what I'm going to do here is say a .then. And I'm going to say the response of this action is going to be a console.log of the response. And then the .catch is just going to be a simple print of the error. So if you understand how asynchronous JavaScript works here, and that Axios is producing basically a promise when it makes this GET request here, and that promise then has a potential resolve response or a reject response. So if Axios comes back with resolve, we're just going to print the proper response, and if it rejects it, we're going to print that error out into the console. And with that, we're just going to run node./index.js. And we see here we get all our posts successfully. And just to not print all that out to the console, we're just going to console.log response.length. And we're going to say that the length is the post count. This. We'll just run that again. Post count undefined. Probably response.data. Yeah. Yeah, there we go. Post count 100 posts. Now that we have our Axios instance working here, we're making a request to the JSON API and then getting it back. What we want to do next is basically enable our own Axios client to do things for us, such as, say, auto-filling in this domain address whenever we use our Axios instance. So we do just /post instead of the whole domain, and we interface with the HTTP request before it gets sent to set up some headers for us or do some actions responding to that request particularly. So what we're going to do here is create a new file, and we're going to call it Axios client.js. In here, we're going to also basically make an Axios instance, and we're going to acquire it. And then down here, we're going to say const Axios client, which is axios.create. And we're going to set some basic things up where we're going to set a base URL. And we're going to copy this right here. And we're going to find this as our base URL. We're going to set in headers. And then we're going to say, does it need credentials? We're going to say with credentials false. Here we're going to set up our headers to be const headers, which is just going to be basically empty right now. Here then we're going to start creating our interceptor for our Axios instance. So there's going to be an interceptor for the request when we initially about to make that request, and there's a response interceptor as well. So we're going to say our Axios client dot interceptors dot request dot use, and in here there's basically going to be all the information about that request before it's going to be sent, and that variable that happens inside this is this callback function is going to produce a variable called config, and that has all the data about our request before it's sent. So here we're going to console.log, basically applying headers to request, and we're going to return the config of this. And then here we're going to make our response interceptor. And this will have basically a response option as well as an error option depending on how the request turned out. So we're going to console.log and say processing in API response. And we're going to console.log here. Something went wrong dealing with error. So now that we have this basic kind of client set up, we can go ahead and implement it over here on our index.js file. And here we're just going to say Axios.client. And it's going to be the Axios client file that we're actually using here. Oh, not to forget, we got to do a module.exports, and we're going to say Axios client. We got to export the Axios client if we want to use it in this file. So here, again, we're just collecting the post. We got to remove our domain because that's already filled in for us by our client. And we're going to go ahead and run it. Axios.get, yep, our client right here. It needs to be from the regular to the custom. Processing API response. Cannot read property data of undefined. Probably because we're not passing our response here. So we're going to return a response. And then that should be fine. There we go, yeah. So we're passing our response data back through our client up to the service level where we interface with it. So here, we're applying our headers before the request gets sent, processing API response, and then we get our post back. So what we can do here and say is, in our client, say we want to manipulate the headers before it gets sent. We're going to say console.log config.headers and take a peep at what our headers look like before it gets sent. So right here is our output of the headers for our HTTP request. Just the default stuff you would regularly see. What we want to do here is manipulate this headers right here to add an authorization header, and it's going to have basically, if you're using JWT tokens for your authentication, you would put your bearer token string inside of here before it always gets sent, and you would read that JWT token from your cookies. So here we're going to say JWT string, just to make that more clean. Now this will basically contain now this authorization header when you run it. See right there. So that's how we can apply things beforehand without having to copy paste the same code over and over for each HTTP request inside of our JavaScript application. So we can remove this config headers here. Now, you don't want to particularly put the JWT string right here outside of the client. You want to apply it right before it gets sent because you want to analyze the cookie. Because over here, this is initially sent. So, like, this is the initial load of the client. And then down here, you can affect it every time you make a request. So, best practice is to put it inside of this config function here. And then down here, what we can do is say, if there's a problematic response, so say we get a 404 because we couldn't find something, we can handle that here. So we're going to say error.response.status, and if it equals 404, we're going to console.log couldn't find content, and then we're going to return basically a promise.reject of the error itself. So if I go over here and I say basically just mess up the URL or wherever, it's going to give us an error. I'm going to hide this right here. All right, so applying headers, something went wrong, couldn't deal with it, couldn't find content. So here we're reacting before we even get to interface with the data itself. So let's say if you want to go from one web page to another, so your 404 page, you can do that inside of JavaScript here to say, if you could not find the content, then just send it to a 404 page. And with that, guys, I hope you guys got some knowledge out of this, figured out, hey, I just don't need to use the regular old Axios client. I can make my own custom client and then react to events before and after I send my HTTP request, which helps me keep my code all in one little place and then keeps me from having to write multiple instances of the same code over and over, and just use abuse the client's built-in functionality for that. With that, have a good day, everyone. Peace out.